And here's the lower hull, now ready for the addition of the road wheels. Since the last video, the lower hull has been primed and painted with its base coat, and some weathering has been airbrushed. Now, the purpose of doing this is, like I frequently mention in these videos, is that once the wheels get mounted to the tank is going to be ready to be inverted over. After that point there, it's going to be very difficult, not impossible, to get the lower hull with its weathering. So that's why I take advantage of this location where the tank is sitting to get the paint and the weathering on at this point here. In addition to the paint and the weathering, I also went ahead and added the rubber bump stops that were showcased in an earlier video. Only in that video there, I mentioned that these pieces are the new cast metal components from EastCoastArmory.com and were added to the tank just prior to that of the priming. Now that the base coat and the weathering has been added, the rubber bump stop sections have been added. The way these are fixed to the metal bump stops is with that of small little fasteners, which are supplied with the ECA set. Once the fasteners are on, the pieces are permanently attached to the tank. Now, if you can see that the fasteners are left in their plain metal form, of course, after the vehicle is flipped over, the fasteners will be painted with that of a paintbrush, and will then blend in seamlessly with the rest of the model's work. And of course, the last thing I'm going to do prior to the wheel installation is to remove the protective tape that was added to that of the axle swing arms. Here you can see them removed on one side, and this here is now ready for that of the wheel installation. Now, before the wheels can get mounted to the tank, the rubber tires need to be added. As for the wheels themselves, since the last scene, you'll notice that the base coat has been added to the rims themselves. However, you notice that the weathering has only been added to the center as well as the rear portion. This has to do for the same reasoning that I mentioned for the lower hull. Of course, with something like a T34, the outer portion of the wheels will be easily accessible for use with the airbrush when it comes time for the actual weathering, but this of course will be done much further down the road towards the end of the project. Now, as for the tires, like I showcased before, they are made of rubber and they slip onto the wheel rim. Now, this is a very important procedure, as if these tires get loose on you during the tank's operation, they will chew up and can possibly cause some derailment. And with these type of tires here, it's not like something that you could find off the shelf at your local hobby shop. They are a specialty pattern and can only be acquired through Armortek, which, by the way, might be a good idea to have a couple on hand in case one were to ever get loose on you. Now, as for the installation, I'll be utilizing this super glue that I have here. This is specifically formulated for bonding rubber to metal surfaces and is primarily used for that of radio control cars. I acquired this from my local hobby shop, which has a nice aisle for that of RC stock. Now, to mount it on, first you'll notice that one thing I gotta say is that this glue I've used on a few builds before and I've had some very good results with it. There's enough glue in one bottle in order to complete one T34. This is the last row wheel that I'm going to need to put the tires on, and you can see that I have a little over a quarter of the glue left. So one bottle is all you'll need. Now, as for the glue, you don't want to go crazy and put too much on the wheel rim, as when it comes time for fitting it on, the piece might be mounted on cockeyed, and the glues will set too fast, and you're not going to be able to get the piece on properly. Now, this glue does dry in a medium type speed, in which you do have a little bit of time to get the piece seated onto where you want it, but not a whole lot of time, so you don't want to dawdle when it comes time for the installation. As for the process, I'll go ahead and do this live on camera. I'm going to go ahead and put a bead of glue. Now, I'm not going to put it all the way up to the edge, and I'm not going to put it in the center. I'm going to put it 3/4 up the way. The reason for that is that when the rubber tire gets slipped on, it's going to smear the glue evenly onto the rim, thus having a nice wide distribution of adhesive, which will firmly bond the tire in place. Also, you don't want to put too much towards the end, as when it comes time for putting it on, the tire may rub some of the glue on the outside, which can be unsightly. With the glue on, I'm going to go ahead and line up the rubber tire and evenly space it out. Once the tire is on, you want to wipe down any surfaces where the glue might be bleeding out. Namely, this will happen on the inner portion, but possibly some on the outer rim as well. Now, once you're done wiping it off, make sure that you don't have any more glue on your hands, as it'll become problematic when it comes time to handling the second tire. For the installation of the second tire, I'll be using the exact same procedure. It's also important to mention you don't want to have any type of obstructions onto the rim itself like I had before. It's a good thing I caught it, and removing it will make the tire fit on in an easier manner. Once the tire is onto the rim in its appropriate location, just let the tire sit and the adhesives will start to set. Once that's completed, the tires are now ready for installation. And here are the wheels fitted to one side of the model. The wheels did go on in the kit design way. However, I do want to point out that there is a modification that I needed to have made to the swing arms of the model just prior to the wheels being installed. This is very important. I'm going to go over these mods that need to be made in the next upcoming scene. And here we have the swing arms just prior to the wheel installation. Now, if we can recall, the way this model works is that the swing arm is connected to a very large coil spring, which is housed on the inside portion of the tank. This is very reminiscent to the real T34. The swing arm then pivots on this lug that we have here. This lug does not move with the swing arm and is connected to the tank's internal block via a very large nut. More information about this is discussed in the previous video. However, one point to bring up is that when it comes time to mounting on the wheels, on this model here, I did encounter a issue with that of these lugs. Due to the way they stick out past the swing arm, these lugs here make contact with the rear portion here of the rubber tire of the wheel. I'm going to show in more detail exactly what I mean by this. Here I have one of the row wheels, and I have one of the ball bearings slid into its correct location. I'm going to go ahead and slide the wheel onto the axle in order to see what I'm referring to. Now note, the outside portion of the row wheel is facing towards the outside of the vehicle, which is correct, and the orientation of the wheel is appropriate on the axle. Once fitted, you'll see that the piece does look like it is seated all the way. However, there is about a 1/16 of an inch recess between the ball bearing and the mounting point of the swing arm. At this point here, the wheel is very stiff and will not rotate in a smooth manner. To get a good idea of what I'm referring to, here goes the wheel up close. Here we have the face of the wheel. Now, at first glance, this looks like it's in properly. However, you'll notice that there is a small 1/16 of an inch gap between the end of the axle and the ball bearing that we have here. And this is true for all the Armortek tanks. In order for the wheel to be on the axle in the correct manner, these two pieces should be absolutely flush with each other, as once the lock cap goes on, this will allow the wheel to spin freely as it's not making contact or very little contact with this piece here of the ball bearing. If we look to the side here, you'll see what's causing the issue. Here we have the rubber tire, which is properly seated onto the row wheel, and here we have the lug for that of the pivoting piece. You'll notice that the rubber tire is making contact with this lug. Now, this is very important to point out, as you can easily make this piece work by bolting it on and going throughout the rest of the process. This is specifically true for anyone who's a beginner and working on one of these kits for the first time. If you do this, this is definitely going to be leading to some issues, as the wheels are not spinning freely and eventually are going to wear out the back portion here of the rubber tire against this lug. This is going to cause some serious issues, and it's definitely one that needs to be nicked in the butt at this point here of the build. Now, in addition to the lug being present on the row wheels that are causing the issue, towards the center here of the vehicle and towards the rear quarter, the way the suspension will start pivoting, you'll notice that the wheel may also make contact with this lug when the suspension is at its bottom lowest point. This is also something that needs to be addressed by the builder, again, at this point. Now, due to the shape of the Christie suspension, this only needs to be done to one or two of the wheels in this section here of the model. The wheel in the front here does not need that procedure made. Also, it's important to point out that with the very first row wheel, this can be mounted as is, as there is no lug that emits from the swing arm that we have here. Now, as for the actual removal process, this is going to be done with that of an angle grinder. I can use a Dremel for the same application. However, this will put an excessive amount of wear and tear on the Dremel and will definitely shorten the lifespan of the tool. However, if anyone wants to use the Dremel, this can be done with that of a sanding drum, as well as possibly even a cutting stone, which should yield the same results. For me, like I said, I'm going to be utilizing the angle grinder. And here you can see the lug now marked with how much material needs to be removed. It's roughly about half of the piece needs to be ground down in order for the wheel to be positioned fully and still rotate nice and smoothly. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that in addition to the wheel needing to rotate in this portion over here, because of the way the swing arm functions, like I mentioned before, this lug here stays put and does not rotate. Because of that, care must be exhibited by the builder, as well as also the idea that you need to remove not only this section here, but also a little bit past this point. The reason for that has to do, again, with that of the motion of the road wheel. If it spins over here in this location, that's fine, but if you do not remove the necessary amount of material further in, when the wheel goes to articulate with the suspension, the rubber is going to snag up on the lug and hold it in place, preventing it from turning, which again can lead to issues. So these must be addressed by the builder again at this point. Now, I also want to point out that something like this should ideally be done prior to the tank being painted and weathered at this point over here. This was something that I did not anticipate, nor was I expecting, and was definitely something that caught me totally by surprise. If I was building one of these models over again, I would definitely check this prior to the addition of the primer and the paint. Because once the procedure is done, I basically have to repeat the priming, painting, and weathering process to these locations just prior to the reinstallation of the wheels. Another thing to point out has to do with that of safety. Because of the tool and the type of procedure that I'm going to be using, this is going to emit a ton of filings as well as other dirt and debris from not only the steel being ground down, but also of the cutting stone itself on the angle grinder. This material is definitely not something that you want to get in your lungs, so a respirator is going to be required to do this job, as well as also eye protection, and for me, with how loud this tool is, also some hearing protection is definitely going to be utilized. Cleanup is also going to be a little bit problematic, specifically again because the model is pre-painted and weathered. Cleaning the surfaces off is going to be another chore that needs to be done, but is again an important one to bring up. I'll be going over more about that again after the procedure is completed. With my respirator and hearing protection, not to mention eye protection now being worn, I'm going to do the modification, and I'm going to do it in real time in order for the viewers to get a good idea on the amount of work it takes to refine these pieces down. With the angle grinder, this does cut down on the work time immensely, and it does speed up the job as opposed to doing it with something like a Dremel. Here we go. The trick when doing this procedure is to go as fluid as possible, and you don't want to cut into it, you just want to glide the cutting bit over the steel in a nice, parallel, and consistent way, which after a few passes is going to remove the amount of material till you have an angled shape surface like you see here. It's also important to keep in mind that you want to check periodically in between grinding and see if the wheel fits on and spins nice and freely in both the steady and retracted state of the running gear. At this point, I'll go ahead and fit on the piece. You want to definitely do it with the ball bearings in place, as it simulates what the wheel will be like once fitted. Okay, the wheel is sliding absolutely perfectly, and I'm now going to rotate the piece with the suspension going up and down. If there's any sort of obstruction, the wheel, of course, will stop dead in its tracks. With a screwdriver, I'll be able to articulate the suspension from the underneath of the tank, like the way you see it over here. And there we have it. The material is fully removed, and the wheel spins perfectly freely in both the standard and articulated state. It's at this point now where I'm going to go ahead and make the same modification to the remainder of the torsion bars. Now, as you just saw, the wheel went to a dead stop when I retracted the suspension. This was because it was making contact with this section here of the reverse swing arm. Here you can see the paint where it was scratched, and in addition to grinding down on this side, some material will be removed on the opposite side as well. Now, it's not nearly as much as needs to be removed on the main side, but it is just enough, just so again the rubber clears when the suspension is in its articulated state. Once the last of the material is removed, it is then time to start the cleanup. Now, as you can see, there is a lot of mess that was created by this procedure. Now, you can't just simply, with a broom or a brush this material off, as these filings here will actually cause damage to the finish, and that's definitely not something you want to do at this point. You can try to use a vacuum, but from my experience, the vacuum does not get all of the material off, and there's always going to be some kind of a film left behind. Now, to get the material off, I'm going to be using a two-pronged approach. I'm going to be using compressed air from my shop's air compressor to blow physically air onto the piece, which will remove the filings. And I'm also on the opposite end going to have my shop's vacuum, which will go ahead and pick up the material that has now been dislodged with the compressed air. This will give you the best case scenario of removing the filings from the finish without causing any damage, and also will not cause a big mess in the shop now that the filings are airborne. Of course, you do want to wear a respirator during this procedure. Once the filings are all removed, it's then time to reapply the tank's finish. Now, as for the pieces, normally a primer is added, which both act as a way to protect the metal from any sort of corrosion, but it's also used as a good foundation to apply the base coat on top of it. Now, normally I utilize aerosol cans for that of the primer. However, because of the way the model is already built and painted in this format, I went ahead and used a different format. Rather than utilizing aerosol cans, I went ahead and applied an enamel paint via a paintbrush. As for the paint itself, it's basic Rust-Oleum flat black, which does do the same exact job in both protecting the metal and also adding that for a good foundation for the base coat. Now, because these pieces are steel, they are susceptible to corrosion such as rust. Now, like I frequently mention, for my base coat, I utilize that of flat exterior latex paint. If this paint is applied directly to the exposed steel, because of the water content inside of this paint, this will make the steel susceptible for that of rust. By applying the Rust-Oleum first, or any type of primer coat first, this will protect and seal off the steel from being exposed to the water in the paint and will prevent it from corroding a lot better than if you just apply the paint direct. Once the paint is fully dried, I'm then going to go ahead with my airbrush with the base coat and then later on the weathering, blending everything in as it was prior to the procedure being done. And here are the swing arms with their base and the weathering now added. As you can see, they blend in with the rest of the paintwork and look exactly as they did previous to the modification and the detour that had to have been made. It is at this point now where I could go ahead and start mounting on the road wheels. As for mounting on the wheels, this is done with the same type of system that I've showcased on many of these other Armortek builds that I've done in the past. First thing I do is with a smear of grease, I add a nice little layer to that of the exposed steel. Now, like I always mention, whenever I'm building these tanks, these are always masked up because I want to protect them from that of added layers of paint. This has to do with that of the mounting of the ball bearings. If there's any sort of layers of paint on these sections here, it's going to make the installation of the parts a lot more difficult. With the pieces being bare steel, of course, they are going to be susceptible for that of oxidation and rust, specifically on something on the ground like this that dries around and may be exposed to moisture. This is why the grease comes in effect, which protects the steel, preventing it from any sort of corrosion. Also, it helps with the installation of the ball bearings and the wheels as a whole. After the grease is added to the shaft, it's then time to mount the ball bearings to the wheels. Now, just like with most Armortek tanks, the T34 kit utilizes 2 ball bearings, one on the inside, one on the outside, to center the wheel onto the spindle and lets it roll very freely. The ball bearings simply just slide directly in place. Now, sometimes they may be a little snug due to the tolerances of the machining, but also with any layers of paint that are added on it. If this is the case, some taps with a rubber mallet are generally enough to get everything seated in place. If worse comes to worse, with a Dremel, with a very light sanding drum, you could remove just a small amount of material for the pieces to fit in, but this is something that almost never has to be done. Once the pieces are, or the bearings are in place, I simply just slide the wheel into place. Once the wheel is inserted, you want to push up against the wheel up until it hits the back stop portion of the swing arm, which is the way the kit is designed and is the way the wheel is properly mounted. Now, if we notice on the front, you'll see that the bearing is completely flush with that of the face portion of the axle. If we go ahead and remember back to when I first tried to mount it, and there was that gap between these two pieces. This is what the piece should look like, not just on this build, but also on the other Armortek builds that use this type of system as well. Now, to mount it in place, I'll be utilizing the kit design component, which is that of a countersunk fastener on a CNC'd steel little disc. The way this works is that you will simply bolt this to the axle that is threaded, and once everything is in place, this disc here will prevent the wheel from backing off and falling off, but the wheel can still spin freely even though it's secured in its lateral state. Now I'm going to utilize a little smear of blue Loctite. Red Loctite can also be used on this application. The one I would avoid using is that of the weakest strength, which I believe is purple. Now, so far on this build, I noticed that when I fully max out the fastener and tighten it on the piece, the wheel is not constrained. On some builds, when I tighten the piece, it will sometimes sandwich the wheel and prevent it from spinning freely. To which then I go and I back out very slightly, just so it frees up the tolerances so that the wheel could spin freely, and then the Loctite hardens and keeps everything in place, and the wheel will not fall off. Now, on this tank over here, that has not been the case that I have seen. I can tighten the fastener and bottom it out, and the wheel will still spin completely freely without there being any issues of it being constricted. And here's the tank now with all of the row wheels added. Just like with all Armortek models, the row wheels spin very nice and fluidly, and the suspension works the way it was designed. It is at this point now where I can go ahead and start mounting on the hubcaps, and I can also get the tank flipped over so I can work on the idler mount and the rear sprockets. Once the road wheels are fitted to the model, the next step is to add on the hubcaps. As for the hubcaps, like I showcased earlier, the kit supplies you with these components that you see here. They are comprised of a CNC bit of aluminum and with thread into the hub section stem of the road wheel, thus keeping it in place. Now these pieces here are very basic in their detailing, but will give you the overall look and feel of the T34 hub. However, rather than utilizing these, I saw an opportunity to go ahead and enhance the kit further from using these kit originals. Rather than utilizing these components, I went ahead and developed these new replacement hubcaps that I have here. These three components are new additions to the EastCoastArmory.com product line, and these pieces here are made out of 3D printed materials. Currently, there are three options available for the T34 hubcaps that are found on the ECA catalog. Just like with many other military vehicles, because the T34 was made by several different manufacturing wings, as well as for a period of time, there are variations with the hubcaps design and shape that alter between these three factors. Now, from what I've seen, these three seem to be the most common types. However, there may be other variations out there that, if come to my attention, I can possibly render as well. Currently, like I said before, I just have these three types on hand. Now, they look very similar to each other at first glance, but do have different detailing and features to them, of which I'll go over now. Starting with the hub on the right, this hub here is one of the more simplistic patterns, in which the center is just a very large dome, and the dome actually comes very close to making contact with that of the mounting fasteners. On these locations are actually small little cutouts that are present, and these allow the clearance for that of the fastener to be mounted and removed. The next pattern is the one that I have here in the center. This one here has a appearance which is very similar to the first pattern that I showed, but this one here, if we notice, the dome stops short of the fasteners, and there's actually a cutoff shelf point that we have here. If we see the fastener, you can see that there's a gap in between the fastener and the hub itself. And you could also see from this angle the cutoff point where the dome comes down and then goes straight down to the bottom, rather than it making direct contact with that of the shelf. The third pattern has a different shape compared to the other two. Rather than having the dome actually starts at this point here and moves its way up, but as for the bottom, instead of going straight in a 90 degree, there's actually a taper to it. We could see it here in the light, and you can see the clearance between the fastener and the piece. Now, these pieces are sold on the ECA catalog, like I mentioned before, and are offered, again, in three ways. You can equip the entire tank with either one of each type of pattern, or you can get the mix and match set, which goes ahead and allows you to have all three of these variants on the tank, as this was commonly seen in the field. Now, as for mounting the hubs to the road wheels, this is going to be done with some adhesive. Now, as for the type of adhesives, for this I'm going to be utilizing that of clear silicone. The reason for the silicone is that it does give me a very nice bond with the piece, and it holds it in place for as long as it needs to be there. However, it's technically a temporary bond, so in case I ever, for whatever reason, need to get access to the inner spindle or the wheel itself, the piece can be removed without causing any damage to either the road wheel or to the hubcap. I've used this procedure on many Armortek builds in the past. Namely, I typically do this on sprockets with that of the detail hub insert that gets mounted. This is basically the exact same procedure, just of course done to that of the road wheels, as opposed to just the sprockets on something like the Panther or the Tigers. Now, as for the branded silicone, I'll be utilizing liquid nails. I've used this material on other builds before, and I was very satisfied with the end result. The stuff bonds very well with just about any surface that I've applied it to. As for this one here, I'm just going to apply a small bead around the edge of the hub. Smooth it out with my finger, wipe it off, and then I'm going to go ahead and now mount this to the piece. This is going to simply just plug directly on. wipe off any remainder residue, and the hub is now mounted to the model. I'm now going to do the rest of the wheels on this side. And here's the hull with its hubcaps now mounted. And you can see the different type of hubcaps all intermixed onto the tank. Again, this is as per many real T34s that I have seen. And this is no real surprise, as this is a very common occurrence on military vehicles, in which you have a lot of subcontractors and different plants that manufacture similar parts, and there are differences in between. This is very true for not just the Russian tanks, but also American tanks as well. Something like the Sherman or the Stuart comes to mind. Here you can also see the road wheels, now with their center washer detailing that I mentioned earlier in one base coat. You can see how the piece is greatly improved visually compared to leaving it with the piece absent. With the road wheels added, the next step is to work on the sprocket and that of the front idler. Now currently I am going through the modifications that I'm going to be making to the front idler mounting system, of which I'll go over in more detail in the next video update. Same is also true for that of the sprocket. And with that, that wraps up this project update video for this 1/6 scale radio-controlled Armortek Russian T34 85. If you like this video, stop by and like us on Facebook, where there are more photographs of this particular build that have been posted since project start, as well as the other 1/6 and smaller scale builds that are featured on the ECA channel. In addition to that, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks for watching.